What kind of man writes his greatest words while chained to a Roman soldier waiting to die? And what if that same man once dragged Christians from their homes in the middle of the night? His name was Paul. And before he changed the world had every reason to fear him. He could not lift his right hand without feeling the weight of the iron. The chain ran from his wrist to the wrist of a soldier who did not care about God, did not care about Jesus, and did not care about the old man breathing heavily beside him. To that guard, Paul was simply a prisoner. One more troublemaker sent to Rome to wait for judgment. But Paul was not thinking about the guard. Paul was thinking about a road far away in a country he had not seen in years, a dusty road to a city called Damascus. And on that road, everything he believed about himself had been destroyed in a single blinding moment. He closed his eyes and he could still hear his own voice from all those years ago, younger, harder, full of certainty. "Bring them out," he had ordered. "Every one of them, men and women. Do not let a single follower of this Jesus escape." The soldiers had obeyed him. They always obeyed him. Because in those days no one questioned Saul of Tarsus. He was educated. He was respected. He was a rising star among the religious leaders of Jerusalem. And he was absolutely convinced that the followers of Jesus were dangerous liars who insulted the God of his fathers. He remembered the mothers screaming. He remembered the children clinging to their fathers as the men were pulled away. He remembered telling himself over and over, "This is holy work. God is pleased with me. I am defending the truth." And he had believed it. That was the terrible part. He had truly believed he was serving God while he was crushing the very people God loved. Now, decades later, an old man in chains, Paul opened his eyes and whispered something the guard could not understand. How blind I was. The young men who visited him could not imagine the man he used to be. They saw a gentle teacher, a father in the faith, a wounded old soldier of the gospel. But Paul never let them forget who he had once been. "You think I was always like this," he would say to them. "No, I was the enemy. I held the coats of the men who killed Stephen. I stood there and I approved of his death. Remember that. Never think grace is a small thing. I know exactly how big it is. It reached down and pulled me out of the darkest place a man can go." They would fall silent every time, because they knew it was true. The road to Damascus had changed everything. A light brighter than the sun, a voice that knocked him to the ground, and a question that would echo in his heart for the rest of his life. "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Not, why do you persecute my followers? Me." In that moment, Paul understood something that broke him completely. Every believer he had arrested, every family he had torn apart, every man and woman he had dragged to prison, Jesus counted all of it as an attack on himself. Paul had thought he was fighting for God. He had actually been fighting against him. The blindness that followed lasted 3 days. 3 days in the dark, unable to see, unable to eat, unable to do anything but face the truth about himself. And when his sight finally returned, Saul the persecutor was gone. In his place stood a man with a new name and a mission that would consume the rest of his life. Paul, the apostle, the prisoner, the man who would write letters that outlived the empire that killed him. Now, in that rented house in Rome, one of his young companions sat nearby, holding a pen and a sheet of parchment, waiting. "Are you ready to write?" the young man asked quietly. Paul did not answer right away. He was thinking about all the churches he could no longer visit, the believers in Galatia, the frightened Christians in Thessalonica, the proud, divided, exhausting congregation in Corinth that had broken his heart more than once, the believers in Rome he had longed to see for years, the little group in Colossae, the runaway slave named Onesimus, young Timothy so full of faith and so full of fear. He could not go to them. His feet had carried him thousands of miles across the empire. He had crossed mountains and deserts. He had survived shipwrecks and beatings and stonings. He had been left for dead outside the walls of a city, and he had gotten back up and walked into that same city the next day. But now he could not walk to the room next door without permission. "Paul," the young man said again, "should we begin?" The old apostle finally turned, and there was something fierce in his eyes, something that the chain could not touch. "They cannot lock up the gospel," he said. "They think they've stopped me. They think that because they've bound my hands, they've silenced the message. Let me tell you something. A man can be in chains and still be freer than his jailer." The young man smiled, but there were tears in his eyes. "Then let us write," he said. And this is where our story truly begins. Because most people read Paul's letters the wrong way. They open a Bible, they find one letter, they read a few verses, and they move on. They treat each one as a separate document. A piece of advice here, a famous verse there, a wedding reading about love, a comforting line for a funeral. But that is not what these letters are. These 13 letters are not 13 separate messages. They are 13 chapters of one man's life. When you read them in the order Paul actually wrote them, something incredible happens. You stop seeing scattered lessons, and you start seeing a story. You watch a passionate young preacher grow into a battle-scarred veteran. You watch a fighter defending the gospel with fire slowly become an old man making peace with his own death. You watch a heart get broken and healed and broken again and lifted up by grace every single time. You watch a real human being, not a statue, not a saint on a stained glass window. A man. A man who argued and wept and worried and rejoiced. A man who wrote some letters in anger, and some in tears, and some in overwhelming joy. A man who in his very last letter would sit alone in a cold prison and admit that almost everyone had abandoned him. That is the man you are going to meet in this journey. And here is what makes it so powerful. Paul did not write from a mountaintop. He wrote from the valley. Almost every one of these letters came out of a moment of crisis. A church falling apart. A lie spreading. Believers dying. Friends betraying him. Enemies hunting him. Chains around his wrists. Paul's greatest words were forged in his hardest moments. "Take this down," he said to the young scribe, "and do not soften it. The people need to hear the truth, even when it stings." The young man dipped his pen. But before we follow that pen across the parchment, we have to go back to the very first crisis, back to the first letter Paul ever wrote in anger and love, back to a group of new believers who were about to be robbed of the one thing that had set them free. Because far away in a region called Galatia, the young churches Paul had planted with his own hands were being poisoned. Strangers had arrived after Paul left, smiling men, persuasive men, men who looked religious and sounded holy, and they were whispering something into the ears of those new Christians that made Paul's blood run cold. They were telling them that Jesus was not enough, that faith alone could not save them, that they had to earn their place before God through rules and rituals and religious performance. And when the news reached Paul, this man who had spent his whole life defending the gospel felt the old fire rise up in his chest one more time, not to destroy the church this time, to save it. He grabbed the parchment himself. "I have to write to them," he said, his voice shaking. "Now, before it's too late. They are about to throw away the freedom that cost Christ everything. And the words that poured out of him that day would become one of the boldest, most passionate letters ever written. A letter that would defend the very heart of the Christian faith. A letter that still sets people free 2,000 years later. The prisoner picked up his pen, and he began to fight for the souls he loved. The pen moved fast because Paul's heart was pounding. He did not open the letter to Galatia with kind greetings and gentle warmth the way he usually did. There was no time for that. He was too alarmed. The men who visited him could hear it in his voice as he dictated, and later they said they had never seen him so shaken. "I am astonished," he said, his words sharp. "I am astonished that they are so quickly deserting the one who called them. So quickly, it has barely been any time at all, and already they are turning to a different gospel, which is no gospel at all." The young scribe looked up. "You sound angry, Paul." "I am angry," Paul admitted, "but not for myself, for them. Do you understand what these false teachers are doing? They are taking people Christ set free and putting the chains back on them, and they are smiling while they do it." That was what terrified him. The false teachers in Galatia did not look like enemies. They looked religious. They looked serious. They looked more holy than Paul himself. And that was exactly why they were so dangerous. They came into the churches Paul had planted. They praised God with their mouths, and then they whispered the poison. Faith in Jesus is a good start, they said, but it is not enough. You must also follow the old laws. You must obey the rituals. You must earn your standing before God. And the new believers, young in their faith and eager to please God, were beginning to believe it. Paul had seen this coming his whole life because he had once been one of those men. "I lived that way," he told his companions. "For years, I obeyed every rule. I kept every tradition. I was more zealous than anyone my age. And do you know what all of it made me?" He paused, and his voice dropped. "It made me a persecutor. It made me a man who dragged mothers away from their children in the name of God. All my rule-keeping did not make me righteous. It made me proud. And proud men are the most dangerous men of all." The room went quiet. Then Paul lifted the pen again and drove straight into the heart of the matter. He reminded them of Abraham. Long before the law existed, long before there were rituals to perform, Abraham had simply believed God. And God counted that faith as righteousness. Not his works, not his achievements, his faith. If Abraham was made right with God by believing, Paul dictated, then who are these men to tell you that believing is not enough? They are adding to the gospel. And when you add to the gospel, you destroy it. He was not finished, because Paul knew that the moment he took away the rules, someone would misunderstand him. Someone always did. If salvation is a free gift, they would say, then we can live however we want. We can do whatever we please. Grace covers everything, so nothing matters. Paul slammed that door shut before anyone could open it. No, he said firmly. You were not set free to sin. You were set free to become someone new. There is a difference between a man forced to obey rules and a man transformed from the inside. One is a slave. The other is a son. And then came words that would outlive the empire. Paul began to describe what a life truly touched by God actually looks like. Not a checklist, not a performance, a harvest. He called it the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness. Self-control. You cannot force fruit to grow, Paul explained to the young men around him. You cannot command a tree to produce apples by shouting rules at it. The fruit comes when the tree is healthy, when it is rooted, when it is alive. That is what God does. He does not just make you follow better rules. He makes you into a different kind of person. One of the young men leaned forward. And did they listen, the Galatians? Paul's face softened with something between hope and sorrow. Some did, he said. Some heard me and they came back to the truth. And some... He did not finish. He did not have to. But the letter to Galatia had done its work. It had drawn a line in the sand that the church would never forget. Salvation is a gift. It cannot be earned. It can only be received. And 2,000 years later, that letter still pulls people out of the exhausting trap of trying to be good enough for God. Paul set down the pen and rubbed his aching wrist beneath the chain, but his mind was already traveling to another group of believers in a different city, facing a different kind of pain. Thessalonica. He remembered them fondly. They were young in the faith, but their hearts were on fire. The problem was not false teachers there. The problem was suffering. The believers in Thessalonica were being persecuted for following Jesus, and they were frightened. But there was one fear that troubled them more than any other, and it was breaking Paul's heart from a distance. Their loved ones were dying. Believers in that church had begun to pass away, and the survivors were tormented by a terrible question. Jesus had promised to return. But what about the ones who died before he came back? Had they missed it? Were they lost? Would they never see their family and friends again? When word of their grief reached Paul, he did not respond with theology first. He responded with tenderness. "Write to them gently," he told the scribe. "These are not people who need correction. These are people who are afraid. They are burying their dead and wondering if they will ever see them again. Do not lecture the grieving. Comfort them." And so Paul wrote some of the most reassuring words the church has ever received. He told them not to grieve like people who have no hope. He did not tell them to stop grieving. Paul was too honest for that. He knew grief was real. He had felt it himself. But he told them their grief did not have to be hopeless because death was not the end of the story. "Christ is coming back," Paul declared, "and when he does, the dead in Christ will rise first. Your loved ones are not lost. They are not gone forever. They are waiting, and you will see them again." The scribe stopped writing for a moment. His own eyes were wet. "My mother died last year," he said quietly. "Before I understood any of this." Paul reached out and put his chained hand on the young man's shoulder. "Then write those words slowly," Paul said, "and believe them, because they are for you too." That was the heart of the Thessalonian letters. Not cold doctrine, but warm hope. Paul was teaching a frightened, grieving, persecuted little church that death would not have the final word. Christ had conquered the grave, and everyone who belonged to him would rise again. But Paul also had to correct something in that same church, and he did it without hesitation. Because some of the believers had become so excited about Jesus returning that they had stopped working. They quit their jobs. They sat around waiting for the end of the world, expecting others to feed them. Paul had no patience for that. "Tell them the truth," he said bluntly. "If a man refuses to work, he should not expect to eat. Waiting for Christ does not mean sitting idle. It means living faithfully every single day until he comes. Hope is not an excuse for laziness. Hope is a reason to keep going." It was classic Paul. Comfort in one breath, correction in the next. He loved these people too much to let them drift, whether into fear or into foolishness. And when those early letters were finished and sent off across the empire, something remarkable had already taken shape. Without meaning to write a system of theology, Paul had laid down two truths that would hold the entire Christian faith together. The first was that salvation comes by grace, not by rules, not by performance, not by being good enough. It comes as a gift received through faith, and it cannot be earned by anyone no matter how religious they appear. The second was that hope is stronger than death. Because Jesus rose, his followers would rise too. The grave was not a wall. It was a door. Two truths: grace and resurrection, freedom and hope. Everything else Paul would ever write would be built on that foundation. But the young churches were about to grow up, and with growth came messier problems. Not just false teachers and grief, but division, jealousy, pride, betrayal, scandal. The kind of problems that come when real, flawed human beings try to live together and fail. And there was one church that would break Paul's heart more deeply than any other. A church full of talent and gifts and passion, and also full of arguments, immorality, and cruelty. A church that would make him weep and rage, and eventually pen the most beautiful words about love the world has ever known. That church was in Corinth, and Paul had no idea yet just how much pain it was going to cost him. The reports from Corinth arrived like blows, one after another. Paul had planted that church himself. He had spent a year and a half there, pouring his life into those people. He knew their faces. He knew their names. And now the news coming back to him was tearing him apart. They were fighting, not over sin at first, but over him. They have split into groups. A traveler told Paul, watching the old apostle's face fall, "Some say they follow you, others say they follow Apollos, others claim Peter, and some, to end the argument, say they follow only Christ, as if they are better than everyone else." Paul closed his eyes. "They are dividing the body of Christ over the names of preachers," he said, his voice heavy. "Did I die for them? Was I crucified for them? What have I done that they turn my name into a banner to fight under?" It got worse. There was immorality in the church so shameful that even the pagans around them would have been disgusted by it. And instead of grieving over it, the Corinthians were proud. They mistook their tolerance of evil for spiritual maturity. Wealthy members were humiliating the poor at the very table meant to unite them. Believers were dragging each other into court, exposing their disputes to a watching world. And the spiritual gifts God had given them, the very gifts meant to build them up, had become trophies. People were competing, showing off, looking down on anyone whose gift seemed less impressive than their own. The young scribe watched Paul carefully. "You could stop writing to them," he said gently. "You have other churches, faithful ones, ones that love you. Why keep pouring yourself into people who twist your name and ignore your teaching?" Paul turned on him, but not in anger, in something closer to disbelief. "Stop writing to them," he repeated. "Son, a shepherd does not abandon the sheep that wander. He goes after them, especially them. The ones who are lost are the ones who need the shepherd most." And so Paul wrote. He corrected them firmly, one problem at a time. He rebuked their divisions. He confronted their immorality. He shamed the rich for their cruelty to the poor. He put their precious spiritual gifts in their proper place. But then, in the middle of all that correction, Paul did something no one expected. He stopped arguing, and he wrote about love. The scribe's pen slowed as the words came, because even he could feel that something sacred was happening. "Love is patient," Paul dictated softly. "Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs." The young man looked up, moved. "Those are beautiful words, Paul. Words for a wedding, maybe." Paul actually laughed, though there was pain in it. "A wedding," he said. "No, these were not written for a celebration. These were written for a church tearing itself to pieces. I did not write about love because they had too much of it. I wrote about love because they had forgotten how to love each other at all. That was the twist buried in the most famous passage ever written about love. It was never meant to be romantic. It was a mirror held up to a bitter, proud, divided congregation, forcing them to see themselves. "You have knowledge," Paul was telling them. "You have gifts. You have eloquence. You can speak in tongues and prophesy and give away everything you own. And if you do all of it without love, you are nothing. You are only a loud, empty noise. Tell me," Paul said to the room, "what good is a man who knows every mystery of God but treats his brother like dirt? What good is faith that can move mountains if it cannot move a man to be kind?" No one answered. No one needed to. But Corinth was not only a place of rebuke. In the middle of that broken church, Paul recorded two of the most precious treasures in all of Scripture. He wrote down the earliest account we have of the Lord's Supper. The bread, the cup, the body broken, the blood poured out. The words of Jesus on the night he was betrayed, passed down and preserved so that every generation after would remember. And he recorded one of the earliest testimonies of the resurrection. He listed the eyewitnesses. He named the people who had seen the risen Christ with their own eyes. Hundreds of them, many still alive, when Paul wrote, still able to be questioned. "If Christ has not been raised," Paul declared, "then our preaching is worthless and your faith is worthless. But he has been raised, and because he lives, death itself is defeated." Even to a church that had wounded him, Paul gave his deepest treasures. But the story of Corinth was not over, because after that first letter, the relationship did not heal. It got worse. Some in Corinth turned against Paul personally. False apostles arrived smooth and impressive, and they mocked him. They said Paul was weak. that his letters were bold, but the man himself was unimpressive, that real apostles were powerful, commanding, glorious, and Paul was none of those things. And when that news reached him, it cut deeper than any of the other wounds. The scribes saw it in his eyes. "They are attacking you now," the young man said quietly. "Not your teaching. You." "Yes," Paul admitted. And for a moment the great apostle looked simply like a tired, hurting old man. Then he picked up the pen for the second letter to Corinth, and he did something that shocked everyone who read it. He did not fight their attacks with a display of strength. He answered them by admitting his weakness. Paul opened his heart completely. He wrote about his sufferings, the beatings, the imprisonments, the shipwrecks, the hunger, the sleepless nights, the constant danger, the crushing weight of caring for all the churches. He held nothing back. He even wrote about his tears. "You want a powerful apostle," Paul said. "I will not give you one. I will give you a broken one, because that is the truth. I am not strong, I am weak, and I have learned to boast about it." The young men in the room were stunned. "Why would you tell them your weaknesses?" one asked. "They will only mock you more." Paul shook his head slowly, and what he said next became one of the most powerful lessons in the entire Bible. He told them about a thorn in his flesh, a suffering he never named, a pain that would not leave him. 3 times he had begged God to take it away. 3 times. And 3 times God had said no. But God had given him something better than relief. God had given him an answer that Paul would carry to his grave. "My grace is sufficient for you," Paul said, repeating the words the Lord had spoken to him. "For my power is made perfect in weakness." The room fell silent. "Do you understand?" Paul continued, his voice trembling with conviction. "God does not wait until we are strong to use us. He uses us in our weakness. He works through the broken, through the failing, through the ones who have nothing left to boast about. Because when a weak man does something great, everyone knows the power came from God, not from him." That was the message that turned everything upside down. The world worships strength. It always has. It bows to the powerful, the impressive, the ones who never seem to struggle. But Paul had discovered the opposite truth. God's power does not need our strength. It flows most freely through our weakness so that He gets the glory and we get the grace. The scribe wiped his eyes and kept writing. And when the letters to Corinth were finished, Paul was drained. But he was not done, because there was one letter still inside him that he had been carrying his entire ministry, the one that would explain more completely than anything he had ever written the whole message he had given his life for, a letter to a church he had never even visited, the believers in the capital of the empire itself, Rome. This one, Paul told the scribe, his voice steadying. "I must write carefully, from the beginning, everything. The problem of sin, the gift of righteousness, the meaning of faith, the purpose of the law, God's plan for the Jews and the Gentiles together. I want to leave nothing out." He was going to lay out the entire gospel, start to finish, in one letter. And what he wrote in Romans would become the clearest explanation of grace ever put on paper. Paul began with the hardest truth of all, the one no one wanted to hear, that every single person, religious or not, moral or not, Jew or Gentile, had fallen short, that no one could save themselves, that all the good deeds in the world could not erase the guilt of a single human heart. "There is no one righteous," Paul dictated. Not even one. All have sinned. All have fallen short of the glory of God." The scribe hesitated. "That is a heavy way to begin, Paul. People will not want to hear that they are lost." "They must hear it," Paul answered, "because a man who does not know he is drowning will never reach for the rope. First, they must see how deep the water is. And then," he smiled, "and then I will tell them about the rope." The rope, Paul explained, was a person, because the same God who declared that no one could save themselves had done something no one deserved. He had sent his own Son to take the punishment that belonged to guilty people so that guilty people could go free. "This is the heart of everything," Paul told the scribe. His tired eyes suddenly bright. "A man cannot climb up to God, so God came down to the man. We could not earn righteousness, so God gave it as a gift to anyone who believes." The young man wrote quickly, but he had to ask, "Anyone, even the worst of them?" Paul laughed softly, and there was something raw in it. "Especially the worst of them," he said. "I persecuted the church of God. I approved of murder. If grace can reach a man like me, it can reach anyone. That is not a weakness in the gospel. That is its whole power." And then Paul spoke the words that would set free more souls than perhaps any sentence he ever wrote. He declared that there was now no condemnation for those who belonged to Christ. None. Not for past sins, not for present failures, not for the accusing voice that whispers to every believer in the dark that they are not good enough. "Tell them," Paul said fiercely, "that if God is for them, it does not matter who is against them. Tell them that nothing can separate them from his love. Not death, not life, not their worst day, not their deepest shame, nothing." That was Romans, Paul's masterpiece, the clearest picture of grace ever written, sent to the very center of the empire that would one day take his life. But the years kept moving, and they were not kind to Paul. He was arrested again, and this time the chains did not come off. Yet here is where the story turns, in a way no one expected, because those prison walls meant to silence Paul forever became the birthplace of 4 of the most beautiful letters he ever wrote. The empire thought it had buried him. Instead, it had handed him a pen and time. The first came to the church at Philippi, and it stunned everyone who read it. Because a letter written from a prison cell by a man in chains facing possible execution was somehow overflowing with one thing: joy. "How," the scribe asked him one day, unable to hide his confusion, "how can you write about joy from a place like this? You have every reason to despair." Paul looked at him with the patience of a man who had already fought this battle in his own heart and won. "Because joy was never about my circumstances," he said. "If my joy depended on comfort, I lost it years ago. My joy depends on Christ, and they cannot chain him." Then Paul spoke the words that millions would cling to for 2,000 years, that he had learned to be content in every situation, whether he had plenty or nothing, whether he was full or hungry, whether he was free or in prison. "I can do all things," Paul said, "through Christ who strengthens me." The scribe wrote it down, then paused. "People will think that means they can achieve anything they dream of." Paul shook his head. "No," he said. "That is not what I mean. I am not promising them success. I am promising them strength, strength to endure, strength to stand when everything is falling apart. I did not say I can do all things when life is easy. I said I can do all things through Christ, even suffering, even this. The next letter went to Colossae, and it came out of alarm, because word had reached Paul that teachers there were telling the believers that Jesus was not enough, that they needed something more. Secret knowledge, special rituals, extra spiritual experiences to be truly complete. Paul had heard this lie before in Galatia, and it lit the same fire in him. Again, he said, gripping the pen. They are doing it again, adding to Christ, as if the Son of God needs help, as if the one who created everything, who holds the entire universe together, is somehow not enough. He answered them with a thundering truth. Jesus is enough. In Christ, Paul wrote, the fullness of God lives in bodily form, and in Christ believers already have everything they need, not part of what they need. Everything. There is no secret knowledge to unlock, no ritual to master, no higher level to reach. To have Jesus is to have it all. When you have the ocean, Paul said, why go looking for a puddle? But the third prison letter was different from all the others. It was not written to a church. It was written to one man. And it was about a runaway slave. His name was Onesimus. He had belonged to a Christian named Philemon, and he had run away possibly after stealing from his master. By law, a runaway slave could be punished severely, even killed. But somehow, in the vast empire, this frightened runaway had crossed paths with Paul in prison. And there, in chains, Onesimus had met Christ. The scribe was moved as he watched Paul work on this letter, choosing every word with care. "You are sending him back?" the young man asked. "Back to the master he stole from. They could execute him." "I am sending him back," Paul said quietly, "but not as he left." And then Paul made a request that would quietly begin to crack the foundations of slavery itself. He asked Philemon to receive Onesimus, not as a slave anymore, but as a brother, as an equal, as family. "Charge whatever he owes you to me," Paul wrote. "I will pay it myself. But remember, Philemon, that you owe me your very soul." It was the gospel working on the smallest, most personal scale. Not a sweeping law, not a political revolution, just one heart asking another heart to see a slave as a brother because of what Christ had done. The gospel was changing the world one relationship at a time. And then came the grandest of the prison letters, Ephesians. If Romans explained the gospel and Colossians defended Christ, Ephesians revealed the plan. God's eternal, breathtaking plan for the church. Paul wrote that before the world was even made, God had a purpose: to take people from every nation, every background, every race, Jew and Gentile alike, and make them into one family, one body, one church. "There is no wall anymore," Paul said, his voice full of wonder even in that prison. "The things that divided us are gone. We are not built on human power. We are built on Christ. He is the cornerstone, and everything else is being fitted together around him." The scribe stopped and looked at the man before him. An old prisoner in chains, dictating the destiny of the entire church, while soldiers stood guard outside. "Paul," he said slowly, "do you realize what you have done? They locked you up to stop your voice, and you have written some of the most powerful words the world will ever read from inside their own prison." Paul smiled and lifted his chained wrist so the iron caught the light. "Let me tell you the great secret they never understood," he said. "You can chain a man. You can chain his hands. You can chain his feet. You can lock him in a cell and throw away the key. But you cannot chain the gospel. The word of God is not bound. It goes wherever it wants. It walks through walls. It escapes through letters. It runs out into the world while the prisoner sits still." And that answered the question this whole journey began with. How does a man in chains, waiting to die, write words that change the world? The answer was that Paul had discovered something his jailers never could. His freedom was never in his hands or his feet. It was in his soul. And that no empire, no prison, no chain, and no executioner could ever touch. The man who once dragged Christians from their homes had become the man who could not stop giving Christ away even in irons. But even the strongest voice grows quiet in the end. And Paul, the tireless apostle, the prisoner who could not be silenced, was approaching the final season of his life. One more arrest was coming, one more prison, and this time there would be no letters of joy about strength in suffering. This time Paul knew the end had come, and the last words he would ever write would be the most personal, the most tender, and the most heartbreaking of them all. The second imprisonment was nothing like the first. There were no visitors coming and going freely now, no comfortable rented house. This time, Paul was treated like a common criminal, thrown into a cold, damp cell, chained like a man the world wanted to forget. And this time, he was not waiting for a trial that might end in release. He was waiting to die. He knew it. He felt it in his bones. And in that final darkness, the man who had written to entire churches, who had shaped the theology of the whole Christian faith, sat down to write one last letter. Not to a congregation, to a single young man he loved like a son. Timothy, the scribe who had traveled with him for so long, was gone now. So Paul wrote in a way that was slower, heavier, more personal than anything before. And the first thing that broke through was not triumph. It was loneliness. "Do your best to come to me quickly," Paul wrote, and the words carried an ache. "Timothy, come soon. Winter is coming, and I am cold. Bring the cloak I left behind, and bring the scrolls, especially the parchments." An old man facing execution asking for a coat to keep warm and something to read. There is nothing more human in all of Scripture. Then came the confession that revealed just how alone he truly was. "Everyone has deserted me," Paul admitted. "Demas loved this world and left me. Others have gone. Only Luke is still here. At my first defense, no one stood by my side, not one person. They all abandoned me. If you had told the young Saul of Tarsus, powerful and respected and surrounded by influence, that he would die like this, forsaken and freezing in a Roman cell, he would have laughed. But here was the twist that the world could never understand. Paul was not bitter. He was not broken, because in the very next breath, after admitting that every human being had left him, he wrote something that changed everything. "But the Lord stood by me," Paul said, "and gave me strength." He had lost his freedom. He had lost his friends. He had lost his health, his comfort, his reputation, and soon he would lose his life. But he had not lost the one who mattered. And a man who still has Christ has not truly lost anything at all. Paul knew Timothy would be afraid. The young man was timid by nature, easily discouraged, and now his father in the faith was about to be executed. So Paul poured his final strength into lifting him up. God did not give us a spirit of fear, Paul urged him, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. So do not be ashamed of the gospel. Do not be ashamed of me, his prisoner. Guard what has been entrusted to you. Preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. Endure hardship. Do the work. Finish what I started. It was a torch being passed. Paul could feel his own hands weakening, and he was pressing the flame into the hands of the next generation before the darkness took him. And then he wrote the words that would echo through 2,000 years of history. The final report of a soldier who had reached the end of the war. I have fought the good fight, Paul wrote. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. He set down the pen for a moment when those words were written, because they were true. Every one of them. He had fought. Oh, how he had fought. Against false teachers who tried to poison the gospel with rules. Against division in Corinth. Against lies in Colossae. Against his own weakness, his own thorn, his own tears. He had been beaten with rods and whipped until his back was torn open. He had been stoned and left for dead. He had been shipwrecked, gone hungry, gone sleepless, been betrayed and abandoned. And through all of it, he had never once let go of the message. He had finished, not quit, not given up halfway. Finished. The man who started on the road to Damascus as an enemy of Christ was ending his race as Christ's most faithful servant, and he had kept the faith. He had guarded the gospel with his life, and now he was handing it off intact, undamaged, undiminished to a young man named Timothy, who would hand it to others, who would hand it to others, all the way down through the centuries until it reached us. There is a crown waiting for me, Paul wrote, and you can almost hear the peace in the words. A crown of righteousness which the Lord will give me on that day, and not only to me, but to everyone who has longed for his appearing. That was the last of it, the final letter. Tradition tells us that not long after Paul was led out of that cell for the last time and executed under the emperor's order, his voice was silenced, his body was buried, his chains at last fell away. But here is where the story reaches its stunning conclusion. The empire that killed him is gone. Rome fell. Its emperors are dust. Its armies are ashes. The men who signed Paul's death warrant are forgotten by all but historians. The prison that held him crumbled centuries ago, and the letters of the prisoner they executed, they are read today in more languages, in more nations, by more people than at any moment in human history. Billions of lives have been shaped by the words a chained old man scratched onto parchment in his darkest hours. The Galatians who were told faith is enough. The Thessalonians who were promised they would see their dead again. The Corinthians who were taught what love truly is. The Romans who learned there is now no condemnation. The Philippians who found joy in a prison. The Ephesians who discovered they were one family. Onesimus, the runaway slave who became a brother. And Timothy, the frightened young man who was told to finish the race. When you read Paul's letters in the order he wrote them, you do not just read theology. You watch a life. You watch a proud, violent young man get knocked to the ground on a dusty road and rise up a different person. You watch him fight and weep and worry and rejoice. You watch him get his heart broken by the people he loved and love them anyway. You watch him grow old in chains and grow stronger in spirit. and you watch him face death with 3 simple, unshakable sentences. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. So the question this journey asked at the very beginning has its answer. How does a man in chains waiting to die write words that outlive the empire that killed him? He does it because his real freedom was never something the empire had the power to take. He does it because he had already given his life away to something greater than himself, and a man who has done that has nothing left to fear. Paul's greatest achievement was never the letters as beautiful as they are. His greatest achievement was who he became. The enemy who became a servant. The persecutor who became a martyr. The proud man who became humble. The prisoner who was freer than the guards who watched him. And his life leaves every one of us standing before the same question he answered so completely. When our own race is finished, when our own final winter comes, will we be able to say what he said? Will we have fought the good fight? Will we have kept the faith? Paul's chains are gone. His prison is gone. His enemies are gone. But the words God gave him remain, and they are still setting prisoners free today. A life fully surrendered to God cannot be buried by any grave, silenced by any empire, or chained by any prison. It echoes forever. Paul proved it. And the message he died to protect is still alive right now, in this very moment, waiting for anyone brave enough to receive it.